Good evening. My name is Deb Walker, and I'm pleased to serve as the Executive Director of Citizens Project. Thank you so much for being here tonight. As part of our ongoing commitment to civic engagement, transparency, and accountability, Citizens Project has hosted nonpartisan election education forums and produced voter guides for the past 25 years. As we've seen the tenor of political conversations degrade, Citizens Project is even more committed to creating space in our community where citizens can have civil conversations about difficult issues. We are honored to create that space tonight for those of you who feel differently about ballot issues to interact with you, the voters, in a respectful manner. This year, Colorado voters will make decisions on 13 statewide issues. Tonight, we will feature 4 of those issues. If you have questions about any other issues on the ballot, we have literature available on the tables in the hall and representatives from the League of Women Voters who can answer any questions you might have. And they're wearing blue t-shirts and they can wave at you. For your friends and family who couldn't attend tonight, they can still hear this forum. It's being recorded by Studio 809, Colorado Springs' own local podcast collaborative. You'll also be able to play it and get a link to share by visiting studio809.com and look for Studio 809 Specials podcast. Additionally, the video of this event will be available at KOAA.com throughout the entire election. Citizens Project Voter Guide is now published. You can find it in today's Colorado Springs Independent and the Colorado Springs Business Journal that will come out this Friday. Events like this are only possible with the help of our co-sponsors and collaborators. And tonight we thank our sponsors, the League of Women Voters, the Independent Center, CONO, the Council of Neighbors and Organizations, ACLU, Colorado Nonprofit Association, and the One Colorado Educational Fund. Additional sponsors include Planned Parenthood, Colorado Common Cause, and COPPER, the Cultural Office of the Pikes Peak Region. Thank you to Alasyn and KOAA and the League of Women Voters for making this evening possible. And finally, we'd like to thank Harrison School District 2 for being our host tonight. They have been delightful to work with, and they are very committed to serving families and promoting civic engagement. Without further ado, I'm pleased to invite our moderator, Alasyn Zimmerman from KOAA, up to the stage to explain the rules and kick off the evening. Thanks for being here.
All right, good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for coming out here for our statewide issues forum. I'm going to briefly explain the format and then invite up our first forum participants. Basically, we will announce how much time each person has for their opening statements and closing statements. It's going to be about 3 minutes for those opening statements and 1 minute for a closing statement. And in between there, we're going to have a question and answer session. And we do have a timekeeper up here keeping track of all the time for us. And our participants will be able to see that time as they're up here, so they'll know when they have 30 and 15 seconds left to wrap up. Now, these are the rules that I ask of you as audience members tonight. Please refrain from loud clapping or any disrespectful noises. We want to be respectful to everyone who's up here explaining their side of these issues. And also, we ask that there are no signs in the audience tonight as well. During the question and answer section, audience members, you can certainly submit your own questions. You can do this by tweeting and using the hashtag CPForum, or you can also give them in writing. But we would just ask that you pass on your questions to those volunteers in the blue shirts with League of Women Voters. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. First up, we're going to be talking about Amendment 73. This is the Funding for Public Schools initiative. And essentially, this ballot question is asking people for an income tax increase for anyone who's making more than $150,000 a year. Additionally, it will freeze the property tax assessment rate at 7%. For the support side, we have Roberta Ritvo from Yes on 73. And opposition, we have Michael Fields from Colorado Rising Action. I'd like to invite you both up here. All right, once again, this is Roberta Ritvo with Yes on 73. Thank you for being here, Roberta. And from the opposition, we have Michael Fields from Colorado Rising Action. And once again, I want to remind our participants that you have 3 minutes for your statement. We're going to begin with the support case statement. So Ms. Ritvo, please begin. Your time starts now. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. So as They just said, my name is Roberta Ritvo, and I'm a community volunteer in support of Amendment 73, and I'm not the usual suspect. I do not have children, and I'm not working for the schools in any way, but I believe in the importance of public education, which is why I'm here tonight. Colorado schools have been underfunded for years, and it got much worse in the Great Recession. Our economy is now going gangbusters, but school funding has not recovered. There are many different ways to measure per pupil funding, but under most of them, Colorado ranks near the bottom. We trail even Mississippi and Alabama. We're about $2,800 per student under the national average. And we know that this is negatively impacting our schools. There are teacher shortages all across the state because our salaries are the least competitive in the country. Basically, people cannot afford to become teachers. Many districts are moving to 4-day weeks, not because that's what's good for students, but because it'll save a little bit of money. Other schools are saving money by cutting back on things like mental health supports, career and technical education, even school bus maintenance. And these are the kinds of support and enrichment programs that our students really need. Amendment 73 raises $1.6 billion for our schools in new money. Now, I know that that sounds like a lot of money, and when you see it on the ballot with all those zeros, it looks like a lot of money. But we have 900,000 students in Colorado, and when you divide that across the state, it will help close that $2,800 gap, but it will not even bring us up to the national average. Now, one of the great things about Amendment 73 is that it maintains Colorado's structure of local control. Each school district gets to decide how to spend the new money. And that's important because the needs in one district vary greatly from another, as you here in El Paso County know with your different school districts. And El Paso County is going to be very different, for example, than Grand Junction. Local communities can see how their districts are spending the money and hold their school boards accountable. I'm going to give you an example of the ways in which the schools are underfunded right now. For Colorado Springs District 11, which is the biggest in El Paso County, this year, the school is receiving $846 less per student than it should, simply because the state does not have enough money. That's about a $23 million underfunding. If Amendment 73 was in place right now, instead, District 11 would have gotten over $1,600 extra per student, and that's $46 million more. Now, you're going to hear a lot about what this amendment is and what it isn't, so I want to be very clear. This is a measure that puts new money into our schools by raising some taxes. We're raising taxes on the top earners and on big corporations so that our schools can be better funded. We need the new money. Without it, our schools and our teachers and our children are going to suffer.
All right, Ms. Ritvo, thank you. And from the opposition again, we have Michael Fields. Again, you have 3 minutes. Mr. Fields, go ahead and start.
Well, it's good to be here with you all. It's an important topic that we're discussing today. Ballots are finally out, and so people are going to be voting on this. And so I'm glad that we have this opportunity to talk about all these ballot issues, especially Amendment 73. I'm a former teacher. I'm a charter school board president currently. I have 3 young kids, and one of them just started kindergarten in Jefferson County schools. So I have a vested interest in what happens in our education system here in Colorado. I think we need to do better. I think that we have a lot of successes, but this is a healthy discussion to have. The biggest problem with Amendment 73 is this would be the largest tax increase in Colorado history, $1.6 billion. And there's no guarantees for student achievement, student growth. If you're going to be spending a lot of money, the first question you should ask is, how does this help students? And there's been no clear answer, for the proponents of this. And so I think starting there, it's very important to know what money is going towards and how it's going to help students. The track record for education here in Colorado has shown that basically a lot of money does not get into the classroom. Only 53% of the money that we're spending on education goes towards instruction, so that would include teacher salaries. And I think teacher salaries are too low. I think teachers should get paid more. I think good teachers should get paid more. But currently, education funding is going up each year, and you've seen a decline in terms of what teachers are getting paid adjusted for inflation. If you look at the last decade, we've had a 6% increase in the amount of students, an 8% increase in the amount of teachers, and a 34% increase in the amount of administrative costs. So administration is growing, and there's been nothing to address that. There's been no talk about this, and I think this is why Amendment 73 is a good discussion to have, because we need to look at where our money is going and how this will impact our economy. As I mentioned, this will be the biggest tax hike in Colorado history, and basically you're going to have a tax increase on most Coloradans. It is $150,000 and above as a family, but it's indexed. It's not indexed. Therefore, more and more people are going to find themselves in that position. But it also increases property taxes, something that's not talked about that much. Property taxes were scheduled to go down to 6.11% on the assessment rate. That is going to be frozen at 7%, so that's a tax increase. And it could have an impact on local services. So I think, you look at the impact on small businesses, the fact that we have the #1 economy in the country here in Colorado. We want to keep it that way and have a healthy discussion about how we reform our education system with the money that's currently going to that. So I look forward to the questions, and I'm glad to be here. Thanks.
All right, Mr. Fields, thank you. And once again, we do want to remind you that audience, you do have the opportunity to be asking questions. So by all means, begin writing those down. You can certainly tweet them. We'll be asking this. But first, I'm going to start off with some questions we've prepared as well. And Mr. Fields, I'm going to start with you. Colorado's economy is pretty strong. And a lot of people have been talking about this, and they might be asking, why aren't we putting more money towards our schools? Go ahead.
Well, I think one thing is we are putting more money towards our schools. Last year, we had $150 million above inflation that we put towards schools. My guess, and I'm certain of this, that did not go to the 50,000 teachers that we have. It was not a $3,000 increase for each of them. But I think that's a discussion that the legislature should be having. We have a $30 billion state budget. We have over $11 billion in our general fund. And we need to prioritize that and have that discussion with basically our school districts to say, how are we spending money? Can we have discussions about any kind of tax increases on the local level, which happens all the time? A blank check statewide is not the solution to this, and it does impact the economy. If we want to stay and keep a strong economy, raising taxes on small businesses by 30%, or if they're a LLC or an S corp going up by 78% is not the answer. So I think we need to reform our system, fix para, prioritize the budget, have those discussions with the districts before any more money goes into the system.
All right, and Ms. Ritvo, I want to give you time to respond, and I did not clarify this before, and I apologize, but you have 1 minute on this question. Ms. Ritvo, go ahead.
So the challenge that Colorado faces is that the demands on the general fund are more than the general fund can support. That's why the school districts are underfunded already in the ways that I talked about, the districts not getting as much money as they should be each year. Colorado right now is a very low tax state. And with these increases, we will continue to be one of the lowest tax states in the country because we're just starting from such a low point to begin with. The opposition likes to use scary percentages, but the raw numbers help tell a better story. So yes, there are 54,000 teachers in Colorado, and yes, the number of administrators has risen significantly. But there's still only 2,400 of them across the whole state. That's over 178 different school districts. And some of these come out of the mandated reforms, such as hiring assistant principals to do teacher evaluations. Some of the other people that get folded into administration can be things like the school resource officers or the nurses or anyone who is not a certified classroom teacher. But these are people who are important for the holistic education of our students. The idea that taxes are going up 78% on individuals.
Thank you, Ms. Ritvo. And I am going to direct this question at you as well. Who's holding these school boards accountable in that these are actually being, these funds that are going to come from this tax increase are going to be going to those high priority areas? You have 2 minutes to answer this question. Go ahead, Ms. Ritvo.
Okay, great. So the new money that comes in will be put into a quality public education fund. This is a new fund at the state level where the money will go in and go out. It is protected from being raided by the legislature or used for any other purpose besides public education. The school boards right now decide how to spend their budgets, and we're not changing that. Most school boards in the state, covering, I believe, over 80% of the students at this point, have passed resolutions in support of Amendment 73, and most of them have included in their resolutions how they plan to spend the money. Some are doing it with specific numbers, some are doing it with percentages. So as things are right now, local communities are responsible for holding their school boards accountable for how they spend their money and how they educate their children, and that will continue. And in advance of this vote, many of the school districts have told their communities specifically how they can be held accountable and what they should be held to.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Fields, you have 2 minutes to respond.
Well, I'm totally supportive of local control, and I think that's where the discussion should be happening. The accountability is on the local level. You elect school board members. You can have discussions about tax increases, mill levy overrides on that local level. I think that's where the accountability is best served. I think that there needs to be a discussion about the funding formula in general. Is every district getting an equitable amount of money? I think it's something that needs to be fixed before we start talking about any kind of tax increases. But there is no accountability on where this money is going to go. And so you have to look at a district's track record. And I was reading a story in Chalkbeat about education in Amendment 73, and it was talking about a teacher who had 35 students in his class in Denver Public Schools and didn't have a whiteboard that worked. And so I did a little bit of math and figured out that there's a little over $10,000 per student goes, per pupil revenue in Denver Public Schools. And so $367,000 is going into this classroom, and the guy who's teaching the class doesn't have a whiteboard that works. That's unacceptable, and we need to hold districts accountable, and this does not do that. And so I think that local control is very important. That's where we need to keep this discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Fields. And this question is directed towards you. And once again, Ms. Ritvo, you'll be able to respond. Explain why money for businesses is more important than money per student. This is from our audience. Mr. Field, you have 1 minute to respond.
Well, I think the lesson that you look at in other states, I grew up in Illinois, and the lesson is when you start raising taxes to such a high degree that businesses leave, it has an impact on everything. It has an impact on the budget. The reason why we have the #1 economy in the country is because businesses, individuals want to be here. And so I think, looking at it that way, I think we need to put more money into education. That's a discussion for the legislature. It's something that they can prioritize. We have a state budget that went up $1.5 billion last year. And a lot of that money got split up into other stuff. Some goes to healthcare, some goes to other priorities that they want to make. But I think polling shows clearly that people in Colorado want teachers to have increased salaries, and they want our roads fixed, and that the legislature should be prioritizing that. And districts can have those discussions about if they want to increase mill levies, which a lot of districts are. So I think businesses are important to keep in our state. We need to factor that in, and we need to know what we're going to get for this money.
Mr. Fields, thank you. Ms. Ritvo, you have 1 minute.
So we are raising the C Corp tax rate on businesses that are considered C corporations from 4.63 to 6%. That's where the scary 30% increase on businesses comes from. These are the same corporations that got a huge tax cut out of Washington, D.C. last year. So even with our increase, all of the businesses that are paying the C Corp rate will continue to have a better tax situation now than they did 2 years ago. And to be clear, we are not changing who pays the C Corp rate, just the rate that they change. We will continue to be in line with the states that surround Colorado. We are going to be going from the 3rd lowest C Corp rate in the country to the 9th lowest. So we're still a low tax rate when you look across the country, and we're still low compared to our neighboring states. This is not the kind of thing that is going to drive businesses out of Colorado somewhere else.
All right, and Ms. Ritvo, I'm going to direct this question at you to begin with, and once again, Mr. Fields, you'll be able to respond as well. You have 1 minute to answer this question. Why was the cutoff made for income tax rate increases at $150,000, which expects 8.2% of filers to fund most of the new dollars? Can you explain where you guys came up with those initial numbers, and then anything she says that you'd like to respond to? Mr. Fields, you have 1 minute.
I actually am not fully able to explain where the 150 came from. I know that there were a lot of people involved in an 18-month process to develop this specific proposal. And there were a number of proposals that were considered. And during that 18-month period, People went across the state meeting with advocates and school districts and community members to put forward a number of different proposals, and this is the one that was decided upon. An important clarification is that this is not $150,000 of income. This is $150,000 of taxable income. That means after all of the deductions. So we're looking at people whose total income through salary is higher, probably 175 or 180. And there are tax calculators online where people can see specifically how they would be impacted. Across the state, it's about 8% of the tax filers. Here in El Paso County, it's actually only 7% of the filers who would be impacted by this.
And Mr. Fields, you have 1 minute.
Well, I think the answer is clear that they wanted to make it so that it looked like it was taxing the wealthy. When you look at what it actually does, though, as I mentioned earlier, our property taxes were scheduled to go down. They're being frozen at a higher rate, which is a tax increase. Businesses, they will pay the extra 30%, but most small businesses are not C Corps. They are S Corps, they're LLCs, and they will pay, their taxes go through their personal income, and they will pay a higher rate. If they're at $500,000, they're paying 78% more. And even Governor Hickenlooper talked about, this is a big ask, and he said that he's not sure that it's going to pass, first of all, but he also didn't know if it would scare some people out of the state and certain businesses. So it's not just conservatives or Republicans that are having these concerns about it. Our governor voiced that concern. So I think the attempt was to say this is just going to affect the wealthy, but we know that businesses pass on their costs to us as consumers, and that we'll all be impacted by this.
Thank you, Mr. Fields. And this question, I'm going to give you both a couple of minutes to answer, so you'll have 2 minutes to answer this. Basically, what this question is asking is, how is this going to impact teacher recruitment and teacher retention? And I'm also going to expand on this in just growing Colorado's economy. How do you think this is going to overall impact our state's economy? Mr. Fields, you may begin. You have 2 minutes.
Sure. Well, the Common Sense Policy Roundtable did a study that showed over the next couple decades that this would have a big impact on our economy in a negative way. It would eventually come up to $850 million a year in GDP loss and would cost 11,000 jobs. I think in terms of teacher recruitment and retainment, I think it is a big problem here in Colorado. We have starting salaries that are too low. But we have a system that backloads compensation, and part of the big problem, as I mentioned earlier, is our pension system. It's $30 billion in unfunded liabilities, and as a board member, I'm sitting in front of a budget looking at our $8,000 of per pupil revenue and looking at our teacher salaries and know that I have to spend 21% of teacher salaries on our pension system. And there's nothing that we can do about that. And so I think that the reforms have to happen from the legislature to take that problem seriously. It's impacting schools. And when you look at basically how this will impact, we don't know. I mean, that's the question is, when you're going to spend $1.6 billion, you have to know exactly how we can hold it accountable, what student growth will happen, what will happen to teachers. None of this was planned out, and they just threw this ballot issue on the ballot and said we need more money, and I think that we need to hold them accountable, have those discussions before we talk about any kind of tax increase statewide.
Ms. Riffo, you have 2 minutes.
Passing Amendment 73 will make a strong statement that Colorado supports its teachers and its students and its schools. And that is a message that people who are considering becoming teachers will be able to see and hear clearly. School districts are specifying how they're going to spend the money, and a number of them are putting their bulk of their money and as their number one priority, teacher retainment and attracting new teachers and retaining them and supporting them. It's important to know about the retirement system that Colorado teachers do not get Social Security. This is their only planning for their retirement is through our state system. So it's important that this is as well funded as other aspects of the compensation. And people look at compensation not only as the salary, but the other benefits as well. And a lot of people don't realize that Colorado teachers have given up access to Social Security in exchange for para. We know that Colorado is a growing business community, and that means that our businesses need to be able to hire workers who are ready to enter the work field. And right now, there are a lot of ways in which our schools are not preparing people adequately. There are waiting lists across the state specifically for the technical and career education programs, and those are another area where a number of school districts are specifying that they're going to expand access when they have more money to do so. So I think that passing Amendment 73 makes a strong statement about what we value as voters and as citizens of Colorado.
Ms. Ritvo, thank you. And this is another question that is very common when it comes to education funding in Colorado. This person wants to know, where is all the money going that they are getting from taxing the marijuana industry? They say that this is too much money that's not accounted for. So explain that, why is this needed when we are already taxing marijuana and a lot of people were under the impression that those revenues were going towards education? You have 2 minutes to respond.
Thank you. The tax on marijuana for the schools is something that was put together by the marijuana advocates, not the education advocates. And they were correct that Colorado's infrastructure for its schools was severely underfunded. And so the money is dedicated towards structural spending. So that means buildings. And it comes through a specific grant program, most of which requires matching from the school district. So there are a number of school districts that, even though they desperately need to repair their buildings, can't access this money because they don't have the ability to match the funds. It is capped at $40 million a year. And just to put that in perspective, last school year, the state underfunded education by $828 million. So $40 million is very helpful for school buildings, but it does not begin to put a dent in the school building deficits that are seen across the state. And it certainly doesn't compare to the $828 million money that was withheld from the schools across the state last year.
All right, Mr. Fields, you have 2 minutes to respond.
I think Roberta did a good job of talking about where the marijuana money goes for structural facility, improvements. So it's limited to those things. I think the key, though, is knowing that education money spending is going up each and every year, and it's going up at least by inflation. Last year it went up by much more than that, and we are spending over $10,000 per student across the state on average. And basically figuring out where that money is going is a key to this discussion. And so I think there isn't one silver bullet that's going to fix certain taxing on marijuana or something like that's going to fix the problem. I think that we need a funding formula change. We need to have that discussion first. We've had funding formula discussions before, but only attached to Amendment 66, which failed. And basically, they won't have that discussion without increasing revenue. So I think figuring out where the money is going once it's in the door is the discussion that we should be having.
All right, Mr. Fields, thank you so much. Now, one thing I want to bring up is one of the things that's been talked about throughout this campaign season is adding full-day kindergarten here in Colorado. And so I want to direct this question at you, Mr. Fields. How do you argue that full-day kindergarten is not needed when Colorado is one of the only states that doesn't have it?
I wouldn't argue that full-day kindergarten isn't a good idea. I think that's a discussion that the legislature has to have, and they have been having it. But without increased revenue, there's been no consensus over we're going to give more money towards full-day kindergarten. And basically, I do think that early childhood education is very important. Looking at my young kids right now, I want them to learn how to read as quick as possible. I want them to be successful. I was somebody who was fortunate enough to have a full-day kindergarten at the time. So I think that is a healthy discussion to have, but it has to be had within the confines of the current general fund and what is happening with that money. We've seen healthcare spending eating up more and more percentages of the budget. We've seen less going to roads. And so this is something that legislators have every right to discuss at the Capitol. They can come up with a consensus or not, and that's why we elect people to manage that $30 billion budget.
All right. And Ms. Ritvo, I want to kind of rephrase the question coming from the supporting side, and that is with Amendment 73, you're looking at this big increase and ideally getting a bunch of revenue to fund it. How do you fund full-day kindergarten, or will that be up to the local school boards? How do you ensure that this is something that could actually be a reality under this plan?
So right now, the funding formula for the schools comes with a separate pot of money to fund a few of the extra programs, such as special education, gifted and talented programming, English language learners. And right now, we only fund full-day kindergarten at 58% of the cost of doing so. So school districts can decide whether or not to have it, and if they have it, they only get 58% of the cost of doing that. The money that is going to come in through Amendment 73 is going to increase that pot of money that goes for special ed and English language learning and gifted and talented. It's also going to fund full-day kindergarten at 100%. So for the districts that offer it, they will now be given the full cost of that. Mr. Fields is correct that the funding formula across the state needs to change. Right now, it looks primarily at the characteristics of a district. Is it rural or is it urban, and how many students does it have? And it does not look at the profile of the students, which is why there's that separate pot of money. The superintendents want to change this so that, in fact, the funding formula reflects more about what it costs to educate the students that are in that district. But the formula can't be changed until there's new money, because if you change it without any new money, then someone's going to win and someone's going to lose. And no one's going to approve of that.
Ms. Riffo, thank you. And I'm going to direct this question at you. This comes from the audience. This person asked, the tax increase will hurt many people. In fact, many people are still recovering. With this tax increase, we will lose the breaks we just received. How is this going to help us?
Can you repeat the end? With this tax increase?
We will lose the breaks that we have just received. How is this going to help us?
Okay. So the income tax, as we said, starts at $150,000 of federal taxable income, and that's about 8% of the earners. The first bracket is from $150,000 to $200,000, and most people who are in that bracket are going to pay an extra $81 a year. So that is not something that is going to cause someone to not be able to pay their mortgage. The 78% scary number that Mr. Fields keeps using is for earners over $500,000 after their deductions. That's 1% of the state. And that increase is only on the money over $500,000. This is a graduated, bracketed increase of income taxes, just like the federal system. And even people who are in that high level with their new top rate of 8.25% will pay a total tax bill that is way less than states that have lower rates, like Montana, for example, because Montana's rate kicks in way down at about $18,000. So you have to look at the whole picture, and people have to run the tax calculator on themselves. The idea that the small businesses are going to be hurt because of this, again, you have to look at where those people fall, and only 8% of people in Colorado at all are going to be impacted by this, and that includes the people who are using the pass-through income through their small businesses. So this that's the income tax side, and then as I explained before, for the C Corps, they are still going to be paying significantly less in income taxes than they were before the federal tax cuts last year.
Mr. Fields.
Look, I agree. I don't think that Coloradans need to be paying more money to our state government that has a $30 billion budget. We get hit with fees all the time. We get hit with, obviously our income tax, our sales tax, and there's constantly trying to raise more and more money. And I think the message has been clear over the years that we want the legislature to prioritize the budget and put it towards things that we want done, and that has not happened. And so you saw, in 2011, Prop 103 lose by a 2-to-1 margin. In 2013 or 2015, you saw 2013, you saw Amendment 66 lose by a 2-to-1 margin. And so I think the message is clear. We are taxed high enough. We don't want to create a tiered tax system where we're taxing businesses more, we're taxing certain individuals more people will end up in that that place. So I think if there was a good case, if something was sunsetted, if it was local, if there was a good case for how this money would be held accountable, I think that there would be a better chance of this passing. But I think the fact that it is a blank check that is lost many times, as it's been put on the ballot, I just don't think that the prospects are very good for it.
All right, and Mr. Fields, you mentioned that there's been multiple attempts to get more education funding. So if this doesn't pass, and obviously you're on the opposition, but what is the best way? What's the answer here to find more funding for our schools and classrooms? You have 2 minutes.
Well, I think, and I mentioned both of these, but I think the discussion has to happen on the local level. You guys here know what Harrison 2 does with their money better than anybody else, better than the state does, and you can decide to raise taxes or not here. The second thing is having that discussion with the legislature. If people want more money, that's why we have the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, why we have Tabor here, is to say, if you want to grow government, you have to ask the people. If the people want you to use the money that you have to look at our budget. And I think the biggest thing and the biggest question that I get when talking about this is, where from the budget is this going to come from? The budget's growing each year, and basically, if you create a budget for your family, right? I go and sit down with my wife and I say, you know what, I really don't want to get kicked out of our house, so we're going to pay our mortgage first, and maybe we're going to put some other things to the side in order to do that. The legislature has to do the same thing. If we want to fix our roads, if we want to increase teacher pay, if we want to put more money into education, we do that first, and then we build the budget around that. And that's what prioritizing is, and that's why you need to hold your elected officials accountable and really have that discussion with them.
Ms. Riffo.
So we are running Amendment 73 specifically because of Tabor. We are asking the taxpayers to approve of this tax increase to fund our schools because the schools need the money. Our state budget has not recovered from the recession, in part because Tabor lowered the amount of money that could come in each year, and we are significantly below where we would be given our economy if Tabor had not required that. We believe that this has a very good chance of passing because we've been all across the state working with communities to develop this proposal and to make sure that they know how the money is going to be spent in their communities and that their schools are ready to take this money in and expand. The other part of this initiative, Amendment 73, is about the property taxes, and we've hinted at that. And I want to come back to that specifically. There are two ways to look at it. Right now, we pay 7.2% residential, and it is going to be 7% for the part of your taxes that goes to the schools. So that's a decrease. Now, it is true that without Amendment 73, it would drop to the low sixes. That would significantly deprive our school districts of even more money, which is why we need to stabilize the income that comes from our property taxes. But the other part is that commercial properties have been paying a 29% tax rate on their properties since 1982 when the Gallagher Amendment was enacted. And we're cutting the rate for them from 29 down to 24%. That is a big cut for the ranchers and the farmers and for businesses that actually own their properties. And in many ways, that offsets the increase that some of those people might see on their income taxes. Again, this is only for the part of your property taxes that goes to the schools, and that's a specific line on your taxes. Everything else will remain the same, so we are not depriving any other local jurisdiction of their property tax money.
All right, and I think we're getting into some really good discussion here, so I'm going to invite Mr. Fields to respond to Ms. Rivo's comments 1 minute, and you'll also have 1 minute to respond to this, and we'll wrap that up.
Sure. I mean, I think she clarified the fact that Gallagher is very complicated as a mechanism. It is true that certain parts of the Gallagher Amendment would be fixed, which I believe, and what Speaker Hullinghorst talked about was the other side of it, the local services, the fire, other local services would decrease, and therefore they're going to get a hit because of this. And basically, looking at it, it is a property tax increase because next year this was going to go down to 6.11%. And so to say that this only impacts 8% of the people is not true. And the corporate tax, as we mentioned, is going up. So there might be, the assessment rate might go down on property, but you're hitting businesses on the other side of things. So this will definitely impact our economy. It'll impact, the way that businesses look at, being here or not. They have a lot of choices in terms of other states, low tax states. And so I think this is a healthy discussion to have, especially when matched up against where this money's going.
Ms. Riffo, 1 minute.
Thank you. So Mr. Fields is mixing up the calculation of the property tax rate with the application of the property tax rate. Nothing in Amendment 73 is going to change the calculation. If 6.1 is what it's going to be, then that's what it's going to be. On the property tax bill, what you will see is the application of the rate to all the different jurisdictions that tax our properties. So the libraries, the schools, the fire districts. And there will be two different rates. One rate will be 6.1 for everything except when you get to the schools, and that's where it will be 7% for residential properties. I forgot what my other point was.
You have 23 seconds, Ms. Riffo.
I'll yield it. I can't remember what my second point was.
All right, thank you. All right, we're going to move on to another audience question. This asks, how will Colorado maintain a competitive edge in terms of attracting business if its schools are underfunded and its teachers are underpaid? Mr. Fields, you have 1 minute.
I think that you have to look at outcomes, right? And we're a state that basically spends middle of the pack, 27th, I think the teachers union said, on education. And basically, looking at businesses care about having a good workforce. Absolutely, totally agree. We need to increase student achievement. We need to get students more ready for the work environment that's going to be coming up. Are we doing as good of a job as we can? I don't think so. But does raising taxes on businesses that are here are going to come to the state, is that the solution? I think that this is where we have that discussion about these are the changes that we need to make to our education system. This is the current money that we have. This is where the money's going. And have a broader discussion about what those changes need to happen. This doesn't change anything. This is putting money into the system, the current system that we have, that I think is failing in a lot of ways, but succeeding in others. And so that is a bring stakeholders together. Let's bring businesses into the room and talk about what do they need out of this and what can we do to partner with these different businesses. So I think that it's a great discussion to have, but just dumping more money into the system doesn't do that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Fields. Ms. Rippo, 1 minute.
So businesses have been talking about the need to have workers who are job ready and trained and educated. And our schools very much want to do that. But when they are so underfunded, there are just limits as to what kind of programs they can provide, what kind of enrichment they can provide, and what they can get done with the resources that they have. There comes a point when they have made all the changes that they can and new money is needed. And as we've talked about, Amendment 73 really believes in clarity and in transparency. So we are giving school districts the opportunity, and most have taken it, to tell their communities in advance how they're going to spend the money, and the communities can hold them accountable. School districts publish their budgets online. They have open school board meetings where they discuss them, and community members can continue to attend those and hold the districts accountable for the things that their communities need. Businesses can be part of that as well.
And this is going to be our last question, and then we'll go ahead and go to your closing statements. But real quickly, you will each have a minute to answer this. I'm going to start with you, Ms. Ritvo, and talk about who is funding your campaign, and also feel free to mention the endorsements you have received. You have 1 minute.
So our funding is coming from the teachers unions and from advocacy organizations that support children in schools, and these are some of the groups, for example, that represent families with gifted and talented children or children with special needs. I believe that we also just received some money and an endorsement from the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, for example, and individual donations.
Thank you, Ms. Riffo. All right, Mr. Fields.
Sure. I work closely with the No on 73 campaign, which there's several people that are involved in that. Ready Colorado is another group that is. There's a lot of businesses that are obviously interested in this. Different chambers of commerce, Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce, et cetera. And so I think when you look at it, I think they've raised a little under $1 million trying to get the word out on this. But this will impact businesses a lot, and so I think there has been interest from that as well as individuals.
All right, now we will move over to our closing statements. You will each have 1 minute, and I'm going to begin with Ms. Ritvo. Again, this is 1 minute. This is your closing statement, and this is where this will end.
Thank you. So Amendment 73 is a way to show our teachers and our students that we support them and we stand by them. It is a way to bring new money into our schools and for our school districts to prioritize the issues that are important to them, whether that's teacher salaries or enrichment programs or school security or mental health support for our students. We ask our school districts to do a lot for our students, and we need to support them in that effort. It is true that this is a tax increase. The only way to support our schools and to give them what they need is to bring in new money. The money cannot be rated by the politicians in Denver. It goes into a sequestered fund that can only be spent on our public schools. And we can then, as community members, hold our public schools accountable to make sure that they are doing the best that they can for our students. Thank you.
Mr. Fields, 1 minute, closing statement.
Well, thanks for having me out here today. I think the biggest thing is that I trust you all in this process. I trust your decision-making. And that's why I'm thankful that we have the Taxpayer Bill of Rights that allows us to have these discussions, to vote on this eventually, and I hope everybody goes out and votes. I think the biggest thing with Amendment 73, again, is that it does not, we're not accountable to student achievement. It is a big tax increase. It's something that is a healthy discussion to have. I hope we continue this discussion. This should be the start of an ongoing discussion about the funding formula, about para, about how much money is actually getting to teachers because they're not getting paid enough. So I think all those things need to continue on even if this does not pass. And again, I appreciate all of your guys' input on this. I hope you talk to other people, but this is an important amendment for the future of our state.
Thank you both. All right, let's give them both a round of applause for coming out here tonight. Thank you both. Great discussion. And now we're going to move on to both of the transportation funding questions that you'll find on your ballot. I want to invite both of those representatives to come up here. Propositions 109 and 110. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. Proposition 109 authorizes bonds for highway projects. It's known as the Fix Our Damn Roads Act. My apologies to my mother who might be watching. Now, it requires the state to borrow up to $3.5 billion in 2019 to fund up to 66 specific highway projects. It also asks the state to direct and identify a source of funds to repay the borrowed amount without raising taxes or fees, and limit the total repayment amount, including principal and interest, to $5.2 billion over 20 years. Proposition 110 is a sales tax increase for the entire state. It would increase the sales tax from 2.9% to 3.52% for 20 years and distribute the new tax revenue for transportation as follows: 45% to the state, 40% to local governments, and 15% for multimodal transportation projects. And it would permit the state to borrow up to $6 billion for transportation projects and limit the total repayment amount, including principal and interest, to $9.4 billion over 20 years. All right, let's bring in both of our representatives up here. Are we ready? All right, thank you both for joining us. For the Proposition 109 supporting side, and they're both going to be supporting their initiatives, kind of acting as each other's oppositions. We have State Representative Terry Carver from District 20, and for Proposition 110 of the support, we have Carla Perez from Move Colorado and Let's Go Colorado. So this is going to be similar to the last forum we just had. So you'll have 1 minute for your opening statement, and then we'll open it up for audience questions, and then you'll have 1 minute for a closing statement. 3 minutes. My apologies. 3 minutes. Thank you. 3 minutes for your opening statements, 1 minute for the closing statements. All right, I'm human. I'm sorry. I've been up since the early hours, so please forgive me this evening. And numbers, I went into journalism for a reason, so that's why we have our lovely timekeeper down here. All right, 3 minutes. I'm going to begin with you, Representative Carver, to talk about Proposition 109. Your time begins now.
Well, as you know, based on the introduction, the voters have two transportation funding options on the ballot, Proposition 109 and Proposition 110. I am a strong supporter of 109, and let me lay out the key components of what 109 would do. It is structured after the same kind of transportation bond initiative the voters approved in 1999. So if you vote for 109 and it passes, this would direct the state to raise money up to $3.5 billion with as much as $5.2 total, and it would use that money to build various transportation projects that are limited to highways and bridges. The projects themselves are specifically listed in Prop 109. One of the concerns that we have had in funding transportation is to know what we are voting for. Prop 109 specifies the transportation projects around the state that would be authorized to be constructed with this 3.5 transportation bond that the state would raise. Now, the bond would be paid back over 20 years, just like the transportation bond the voters approved in 1999. When the voters approved that 1999 transportation bond, it was repaid over 20 years without a tax increase. This transportation bond in Prop 109 of $3.5 billion would also be repaid over a 20-year period, and we would pay it out of the state general fund. This is perfectly appropriate when you consider the backlog of our transportation projects that need to be funded in the state, and that this should be a priority in the general fund. So this is something that is doable in our general fund, and we should support it. Just a brief comment on 110, and I know we'll be talking about both of these propositions, is 110 is a state tax increase. Our own Mayor Suthers has stated it so well. We would pay an additional $50 million from the increase in state sales tax here in Colorado Springs and in El Paso County. And we would only get back about $18 million. So it is an outflow from El Paso County to the rest of the state.
All right, thank you, Representative Carver. And now we're going to move over to Prop 110. I'll allow you to make your opening statement here, Ms. Perez. You have 3 minutes, and the clock starts now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come join you tonight and talk about Proposition 110. Colorado's transportation needs has gone unmet for decades. As a result, CDOT is facing a $9 billion shortfall in transportation funding, and that's because the state uses an out-of-source revenue stream to fund transportation, and that's the gas tax. The gas tax that hasn't been increased since 1991. And we recognize that this no longer can meet our needs. When we think about where we were at in 1991, I said this to a colleague of mine, and he said, I wasn't even born yet. So we know it's been a long time for transportation if that's the primary source of funding for it. The number of miles we drive in Colorado has doubled since 1991, and we're investing at a much lower level than we were back then. We were investing at about $126 per driver back then. We're now investing $69 per driver. As vehicles have become more fuel efficient, it is less revenue coming into the highway users tax fund. That's good for you and that's good for me, but that's not good for funding transportation. For a modest sales tax increase of 6 cents on every $10, we recognize that we can achieve a long-term sustainable funding source for transportation in Colorado. Prop 110 is a 20-year source. It's a proposal that would bring, that would fund 107 road and bridge projects around the state. That list is a list of projects that have been adopted by the State Transportation Commission. We recognize that those projects are also going to have the opportunity to be bonded for up to $6 billion, but up to, not required. And this proposal pays for itself. It's also important to note that every trip we take, most every trip we take, begins and ends on a local road. So there's 40% of the money that'll come out of this proposal that'll be dedicated to cities and counties. We know that their issues are very important as well, and it's critical that we invest within the local system as well as alternative modes where appropriate. We are feeling the pressure with regards to congestion. We know that congestion is increasing largely due to the increase in population as well as tourism in Colorado. Last year, 37.9 million people came from out of state to tour and to visit Colorado, and they too will be paying into this proposal. We have a strong bipartisan support supporting Prop 110. Over 500 entities statewide have supported this proposal. That includes a variety of groups like the Farm Bureau, Live Well Colorado, the Gaming Association, the Colorado Realtors, and various others. So please join me in supporting Prop 110.
All right. Ms. Perez, thank you. And this question goes for both of you. Talk about, you mentioned how this would last for 20 years, this tax. But I'd like to, hear from both of you on what's the long-term solution here when it comes to transportation funding? And I'm going to begin with you, Ms. Perez. You have 1 minute to answer this.
We think this is an important step in towards addressing our transportation system. The needs that we have in transportation are significant, and I know you feel it every day when you're driving around or when you're driving the interstate and going and touring around Colorado, since we do ourselves tour a lot around Colorado. So this is a way of shifting from the gas tax to the sales tax in order to be able to address that transportation need.
All right, and Representative Carver.
Well, the transportation needs, and we've discussed this extensively in the legislature, Proposition 109 addresses one very important aspect of that, and that is our backlog of transportation projects. As our population has grown, we have not expanded the capacity of our corridors, our transportation system, to deal with that increase in population. And we have also, we need more funding for road maintenance. So Proposition 109 is addressing the transportation infrastructure deficit by specifically funding priority projects that have been identified around the state, and it does it in a responsible way. It insists that dealing with our transportation needs be a budget priority in the general fund. And this is a key aspect of Proposition 109 because we pay for the transportation bond out of the general fund, and we insist that transportation funding be a priority.
Thank you, Representative Carver. And, with statewide ballot initiatives, a lot of people are wondering, these questions are going out to everyone in the state, but, what's the impact going to be locally here in Colorado Springs, here in Southern Colorado? Talk about why your ballot initiative is more beneficial to Southern Colorado than the others. I'm going to begin with you, Representative Carver. You have 1 minute to respond.
Well, the Proposition 109 specifies the priority projects that our own transportation planning system here in the Pikes Peak region has identified. So improvements to Highway 21 on Powers Boulevard, South Academy, Highway 24. So these projects are some of those projects specified for 109. As opposed to 110, where no projects are identified and it's totally left to the discretion of the Transportation Commission, which is skewed, quite frankly, towards the Denver metro area.
Ms. Perez, you have 1 minute.
Yes, let me clarify that. The Transportation Commission has specifically identified projects for the El Paso County area for that are all on the state highway system. This is in addition to the amount of money that would come directly to those entities for local distribution. So we've identified, based on the dollars that have been that are distributed over that 20-year period, $1.3 billion that would be going to this area for transportation versus $386 million that would be going to transportation under 109. In this area.
And Ms. Perez, I just want to follow up. What's the accountability here to make sure that this money is actually going to projects here?
We have two. One, there's a Citizens Accountability Advisory Oversight Committee associated with this that is built into the proposal that requires certain individuals be appointed to this advisory committee that have technical expertise to review it, whether it's from a financial perspective or from an engineering perspective. And all of those need to be proposed by the legislature and the governor and approved by the Senate.
Representative Carver.
Well, I think there is a complete lack of accountability and transparency in Proposition 110. Remember, we are every Colorado resident is going to end up paying more in state sales tax on almost everything we buy, for a total of $766 million in additional tax every year. And Prop 110 says only 45% of that is going to go to our state highway system. only 45%. 15% will go to a new multimodal fund, which has no transparency, which there are various advisory committees, and ultimately the Transportation Commission makes the final decision with little or no requirements in Proposition 110. So this is a huge diversion of the increased state sales tax we're paying that is not accountable.
All right, and Representative Carver, I'm going to begin with you on this question. You'll have 1 minute to respond. How was the list of projects developed specifically in Prop 109 that they lay out, and can it change if it's needed? You have 1 minute. This list,
there is within Colorado law an established system where the local transportation planning regions around the state identify their highest priority projects. Those are then reviewed up at the state level, and the highest priority projects are called Tier 1 without getting too technical. And what these projects are, and again, it's projects from around the state to ensure that every part of the state is getting some of their transportation infrastructure needs met with this transportation bond. And so those projects, which are totally transparent because they are named, will have that accountability to the voters. The voters will be able to see exactly what this bond is going to be used for.
Thank you, Representative Carver. Ms. Perez, you have 1 minute.
So the list of projects that are included in Prop 110 are the current list of projects that the Transportation Commission, along with the Statewide Transportation Advisory Committee, which is made up of the 15 transportation planning regions that cover the state, including those from the Pikes Peak area. That is the current list of projects of priorities that they've identified. Those projects that are listed in 109 is a very dated list. Matter of fact, there are projects on that list that many of those planning partners do not want to see built. So it's a very challenging situation to have a very public process that has taken time to put together and prioritize based on current needs, compete with something that is older and dated and not up to speed with the type of demands that we are seeing across the state.
And we're getting into a good discussion here, so I'm going to go ahead and add 1 minute for both of you on this. Representative Carver.
Well, in fact, and I sit on the House Transportation Committee, so I can tell you I have extensive conversations with local transportation planning regions, excuse me, around the state. And Prop 109, excuse me, does have some flexibility in addressing the project list, but the project list itself is in fact up to date. And this is where the transparency is. 110, in fact, leaves a lot of discretion to the Transportation Commission under Prop 110 on what projects will get funded and what projects will not. And remember, it is only 45% of the $766 additional $1 million that we're going to be paying. Only 45% in Prop 110 will go to highway improvements.
Ms. Perez?
So the challenge that I think we have in this is that the projects that are identified in 109 are projects that are in statute by project scope. So there's not flexibility in how you can deal with those projects. The ones that are adopted by the Transportation Commission are able to be flexibly negotiated based on the cost and the price that the local entities that are participating in that planning process are willing to put into and see those projects in their definition. So it's actually it's really just the opposite. 110 provides greater flexibility. 109, because it is specifically in the statute, you will not have the flexibility to change those scopes. And it's also important to note that there's not sufficient funding in 109 to actually pay for all of those 66 projects. So it is not transparent in the sense that it does not give the voter the exact, it's leading you to believe that you're going to get all 66 projects, and you actually won't because there's not sufficient funding in the program for it.
And thank you, Ms. Perez. And one thing we do want to point out, I know I mentioned this briefly at the beginning, but these are two separate ballot questions. So in theory, and political experts have said it's not likely to happen, but in theory, both could get approved. So I want to ask you, why is that, or why is that not ideal to have two modes of transportation funding here in the state? Ms. Perez, I'm going to begin with you.
Well, they could both pass, and if both passes, both will go into effect. The challenge that we recognize is that by putting both into effect, there are places where there are conflict, and when there is conflict, they will have to go to the courts, and the courts will have to decide which areas those are that are, which elements of the proposals will be able to move forward. And I think that's challenging for us. One, because anytime you send something through the courts, it's a delay in terms of the implementation. But really, 110 is that long-term sustainable funding that we're looking for. We recognize that if we are looking towards 109, we're only going to get about $2 billion more in the overall system, and we recognize that it is a much greater need in transportation. So, yes, they could both pass, but we really think 110 is the more responsible way to go. It pays for itself.
Thank you, Ms. Perez. Representative Carver.
The latest polling that has been reported shows that Proposition 109 is viewed favorably by over 50% of the voters, whereas Prop 110 is showing support in the 30s. So certainly it is possible for the voters to approve both. We don't think they will. We think that these options represent actually two very different approaches to transportation funding. And one of the things that when we talk about accountability, and perhaps we'll have another question to that topic, remember the accountability piece is how much have you restricted the total discretion of the Transportation Commission in determining projects. Prop 109 recognizes that the costs may differ and not all may get funded, but it limits it to those listed projects.
All right. Thank you. And this is a question I've received I just want to clarify real quickly that those numbers that you just addressed, you're referring to the Magellan strategies poll that came out, just double checking. All right. This has been a question I've received a couple of times up here, and I do want to direct this at you, Representative Carver. It asked, why are we only addressing transportation for our driving citizens? What about public transportation for all citizens, driving and non-driving? This person says our current bus system is almost unusable. So talk about, what Proposition 109 would mean for those alternative modes of transportation. You have 2 minutes for this question.
Well, it is a great question. And I will tell you right up front, Proposition 109 addresses part of our transportation needs. I want to step back for a little bit because I have 2 minutes to say that up until 2009, we funded transportation, the highway system, transit, and other aspects through a combination of gas tax and money from the state general fund. And what happened after the 2008 recession is that the state legislature at the time said we will no longer fund transportation from the state general fund until a certain very complicated formula was met. What that ended up being is we did not provide any money, not one dime, from the state general fund for transportation for 6 years. So from 2009 to 2016, there was no money from that you paid, your taxpayer dollars in the state of Colorado, no money in the general fund for transportation. Absolutely insane. Think about what the population did in Colorado in that time frame. In 2016, we started doing funding for transportation again. This year, we provided an additional $675 million for transportation to go into the state highway fund. So the answer is not to assume that we're limited to the gas tax. It is to insist that your state legislature, your elected officials, make transportation funding a priority. That is highways, that is transit, it is all those elements.
Ms. Perez, you have 2 minutes.
So Prop 110 does have a strong element in it associated with multimodal, and it's really with the intent of giving people options. We want to recognize the fact that everybody who has a car usually wants to keep a car. But we always also recognize that people want options, so that there are opportunities to use an alternative mode of transportation, that it's available to them. In addition, as we were going around from our elderly community to age in place, that people want to be able to have options to be able to stay in their home, but also be able to have services that can come to them, or have transit, what we call microtransit or on-demand transit services that can help them get to healthcare services, that can help them get to grocery stores or whatever type of shopping that they need to have. We also know that with our younger populations, they need alternative ways to get around as well. And so this provides some funding source associated with that. But let me go back to some of the other stuff that we were talking about before. In addition to being able to have the multimodal piece, this also includes maintenance, and maintenance for the existing system. When we look at 109, we recognize that 109 only talks about maintaining those 66 projects that were identified, not all of which are going to get built because there's not sufficient funding to do that. So it's important for us to recognize that as well. When we talked a little bit about the polling, I'm going to raise that as well. We don't have a tremendous amount of confidence in the poll that just took place. We've been polling for the last year and a half. This is the 5th poll that we have that we had done before we moved heavy into the campaign season, and we have been polling over 50%, 52%, 53%, 51%, and part of that's with the tax increase. People are recognizing that there's a problem with transportation, and they're willing to pay their way for it.
All right. And Ms. Perez, since we're on the topic, this person wants to know if either amendment or either proposition addresses the Hyperloop project. Ms. Perez, you have 1 minute.
The Hyperloop. There is I would say not directly. There is a revenue stream associated with with Prop 110 that exists at the statewide level to invest in intelligent transportation systems. That would be the opportunity to look at how those systems can improve our infrastructure in the future, applying technology. So it's not something that specifically says to Hyperloop. It is not something that says that they can't, but it is not a project-specific list on that.
Representative Carver.
No, Hyperloop is not specifically addressed in either proposition, but I do want to expand a little bit on the transit issue. In Proposition 110, it specifies that 15% of this increase in our state sales tax will go to a multimodal options fund. Which the Transportation Commission will decide where that goes. There is very little criteria in there other than listing broadly the types of projects. There is no requirement for equitable distribution around the state of that 15%. And in fact, in the news today, apparently a presentation done to the Transportation Commission in July of this year indicating that potentially as much as 77% of the multimodal would go to the Denver metro area under Prop 110.
Thank you, Representative Carver. And I'm going to direct this question at you, and then I'll rephrase a question to Ms. Perez. This comes from the audience. Out-of-state visitors would also pay the higher sales tax rate. Why shouldn't we capitalize on tourism to help fund these projects? I'm going to give you 2 minutes to answer this, Representative Carver.
Well, it is certainly true that we are fortunate in Colorado to have a great number of tourists. And certainly there would be some expenditure by the tourists, and they would be paying the additional sales tax. But when we look at, with the exception of food and a few other services, the vast majority of this increase in state sales tax will be paid by you and I, Colorado residents. And the vast majority of that $766 million in additional state taxes, we will pay that. And when you look at how that will be distributed, it is not an equitable distribution. And so while I acknowledge that the tourists will pay a small piece of that, I believe it will be a relatively small percentage. After all, this is not a hotel tax. This is not a surcharge on a rental car. This is a ubiquitous state sales tax that applies to about everything we purchase. And so really the burden of this is going to fall on the Colorado residents. And again, our own Mayor Suthers, who has looked at this, done the calculations, we in El Paso County will pay an additional $50 million in state sales tax that we will send out of El Paso County, and we will only get $18 million in benefit. So this is 110 is not equitable, it is not fair, and it is not transparent.
All right, Ms. Perez, now Colorado Springs, it's been mentioned that Colorado Springs has one of the higher sales tax in the state. Will the state sales tax that you're proposing with this proposition, do you think that could potentially be a burden on the tourism here in Southern Colorado? You have 2 minutes.
Actually, let me be very specific with regards to how out-of-state tourists will pay. We know that they come and they spend a variety of their time in hotels, it's on restaurants, it's on entertainment, renting cars, all of those types of things are where the out-of-state tourists will pay. We know that they are estimated to pay about 12% of the total amount. So 92 million of that 766 million will be paid by out-of-state residents or tourists as they come to Colorado. So we don't think it's going to put a freeze, if you will, on anything in terms of tourism coming to Colorado. As a matter of fact, many of our tourism groups in Colorado, organizations, association, are in fact supporting this proposal because they recognize that tourism to Colorado is important for our economy. It's important for jobs, and it's important for people to want to come here. And when we have a good transportation system that can get people to where they want to go, it is only to our benefit in terms of the economy. But let me go back to something that we talked about in terms of the multimodal piece and the transparency. The Transportation Commission, working with their local transportation partners, have identified a list of projects associated with that, with a portion of that 15% that goes to Multimodal Options Fund. And with that, they have identified 18 projects that would be built around the state. Now, when you're bonding, and they're going to bond for those projects, and those projects specifically, 2 of them are here within the in the El Paso County area. So there is a new transit facility that has been identified for Colorado Springs as well as for Manitou Springs. And we recognize that that's important because as we are looking at the investment in interregional transit, when we talk about Bustang, that which connects Denver to Colorado Springs, having those transit hubs are important.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to end our question and answer session right here. And now we're going to move into the closing statement phase. And as I mentioned at the beginning, you will each get 1 minute to make your closing statement, and then that will wrap up this forum for the transportation propositions that are going to be on the ballot. So I'm going to begin with Representative Carver. You have 1 minute.
Well, I certainly urge your support of Proposition 109. This is a very targeted, specific, and transparent to the voter, replicating, taking the same approach we did in approving a transportation bond in 1999 to deal with some of our highest priority needs around the state in our transportation by highway. And the vast majority of our state, it is still traveling by vehicle, and that is where we are seeing the public safety issues, the traffic congestion. And so we believe that this is an important piece of solving our transportation problem. It is transparent, it limits the discretion of the Transportation Commission, and making sure we have equitable funding of this around the state.
Ms. Perez.
So I would really encourage your consideration of Prop 110. We recognize that for 6 cents on every $10, we can make a long-term sustainable funding source available to the state of Colorado and to our local entities in order to be able to invest in transportation and in those multimodal systems. We recognize that this is not an easy thing to do, but we also think it's very important that transportation pays its way. And in doing that, we think we can make significant improvements in the system that we all use, and we do use it as cars as well. But we recognize that we need to be able to do it in a responsible way. And so I encourage your support, join our coalition, and vote yes on 110.
Thank you. Let's give both of them a round of applause. Thank you both for being here tonight. For these two questions, both focusing on transportation funding, you'll see both of them on your ballot. All right, I'm going to take a quick water break real quickly as we're getting everything. All right, I'd like to invite our representatives for Proposition 112 up to the stage tonight. Now, this question focuses on increasing the setback requirement for oil and natural gas development. It would require that new oil and natural gas development be located at least 2,500 feet from occupied structures, water sources, and areas designated as vulnerable areas. So we're going to bring up both of our representatives from the support and the opposition right now. All right, from the support side, we have Ann Lee Foster from Still Colorado Rising. Good evening, Ann. Thanks so much for joining us. And from the opposition, we have Amy Oliver Cook from the Independence Institute, and she's also the spokesperson for the Spirit of Colorado Issue Committee. Thank you both for being here this evening. All right, so this is going to be similar as the last two that we've done. You each will have 3 minutes to give your opening statements, and then after that, we'll open it up for question and answer, and then we'll wrap it up with your 1-minute closing statement. I'm going to begin with the support side. So Ann Lee Foster, you will have 3 minutes starting now.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So why did Proposition 112 come about? This is really the response of mothers, grandmothers, teachers, and nurses to a crisis that has arrived on their doorstep. In just the last year, we saw the deadly Firestone explosion that killed 2 men in their home. And in addition to that, we saw 15 other oil and gas related explosions in the state, resulting in death and worker injury. We see millions of gallons of water being destroyed every year. And in Colorado, we're a very arid state. We don't have that resource to use on that. And we're seeing health studies, an increasing body of health studies that show increased cancer risk from living near oil and gas development, negative birth outcomes, low birth weight, stillborn rates increasing, and increased rates of respiratory disorders like asthma. And over the past 7 years, the community, the citizens of Colorado, have been going to the COGCC, which is the state regulatory body, and testifying, making complaints. We have seen countless bills at the legislature not pass for very simple protections. We've seen no progress being made at the courts. And the communities have been told by politicians and by the state at every turn that nothing can be done to deal with a ever encroaching industry that is continuing to get larger. We're moving away from the single derricks that we're used to seeing and what you see in the ads to large-scale industrial activity. Now it's quite commonplace to permit 50 wells. And so 50 wells on a single pad. This is really an attempt by the citizens of Colorado to balance the scales and to create a common sense protection from a hazardous toxic industrial activity that is currently allowed to be permitted just 500 feet from homes and 1,000 feet from highly occupied buildings. You're going to hear a lot of rhetoric about how this is a ban. It is absolutely not a ban. It is a common sense setback that is intended to protect our communities from toxic industrial activity. There was recently a analysis from the Colorado School of Mines that showed definitively that this is not a ban and that oil and gas activity will continue in the state of Colorado while still honoring health studies and protecting our communities from the dangerous impacts of oil and gas.
All right, thank you. And now we will go over to Amy Oliver Cook. You have 3 minutes.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Citizens Project and all the groups tonight for hosting this forum. Full disclosure, I have a dog in this fight. I'm from Weld County, the heart of Colorado's oil and gas industry. My family and I love calling Greeley our home, and we've had a front row seat to our decade-plus energy renaissance. Our thriving energy industry owes itself to a lot of things, but one of the most important is the bipartisan cooperation that has made it all possible. Take the past 8 years, for example. The industry has worked with Governor Hickenlooper and his staff, state and local elected officials, communities, and local residents to accomplish 3 important things. 1, create unprecedented economic opportunity for hundreds of thousands of Coloradans. 2, contribute to our nation's energy dominance. And 3, they do it while implementing some of the most robust environmental regulations in the country. The revenue generated by oil and gas returns to communities across our state. Weld County is a perfect example. When our county needs to build or maintain something, a roadway or a structure, it doesn't ask for a tax increase, it pays cash. Money from oil and gas across the state helps build new schools, including a fabulous new facility in New Raymer. You know, just a few years ago, kids there were going to school with ceiling tiles that were falling down, mold, and a roof that wasn't even attached. Now they have a brand new facility, and thanks to the energy industry, this rural community, these kids in a rural community can attend a school where they're still connected to the world. And when the 2013 floods devastated my community, do you know which industry sent out their employees, their workers, to build facilities so schools would, or so kids wouldn't have to miss school? Or they gave gift cards so that parents wouldn't have to do without, families wouldn't have to do without. That's the oil and gas industry. They're our friends, they're our neighbors, they are part of our community, just like all of us. 112 is expected to eliminate nearly 150,000 jobs over the next 12 years. 77% will be lost outside of the industry. That means retail, restaurants, public health, and everything in between. It's going to hurt far more than just the energy industry. It's going to hurt all of us. It isn't about sensible regulations. It's about banning an entire industry. And as a state, we can do much better than that. Thank you.
All right, we're going to move to the question and answer session now, and I'm going to begin with Ms. Foster. So both gubernatorial candidates have come out against this. So if this were to pass, are you at all worried that you might see pushback from whoever gets elected or even from the legislature? I'll give you 1 minute to respond.
As I said before, this is really a response to inaction on behalf of politicians. This is the result of our communities pleading for politicians to make protections for our communities. And so we really feel this is a way to balance the scales and show the legislature and the politicians that this is something that truly matters to Coloradans. We collected over 200,000 signatures from registered voters. We have endorsements from the League of Women Voters, Conservation Colorado, hundreds of grassroots organizations across the state. So we feel that the politicians will recognize that this is the will of the people, and they will respect that.
All right, and I will give you 1 minute to respond to her comments.
Well, the opposition to this is bipartisan, and it reads like a proverbial who's who of elected officials and businesses, because they recognize the devastation that this would bring to the oil and gas industry, and not just oil and gas industry, but jobs all over the state. Yes, it would hurt Weld County, but it's going to hurt everyone. Everyone will feel the impact of it. And as far as pushback, I think this is something that would be a trial lawyer's dream if it passes, because you'll see plenty of lawsuits from mineral owners who will obviously be suing over the takings of this. So there will be pushback for sure.
All right, and I'm going to direct this next question at you, Ms. Oliver Cook. You mentioned these explosions of homes, explosions near schools. So if this is not the answer, Proposition 112, then what is in your eyes?
So just to be clear, I didn't mention that, but I'm happy to address it. So clearly the explosion in Firestone is a tragedy. I mean, people lost their lives. But that wasn't that had nothing to do with the setback. That had to do with an orphan well and a flow line. I mean, that was something that was decades old, and it was addressed. You can't take a single incident like Firestone and essentially judge an entire industry because of it. You have to look at everything in its total, meaning all of the products that oil and gas provides that actually save lives. And there are everything from a bike helmet to what you see in a hospital. All of those save lives. So overall, the oil and gas industry saves more lives.
All right, and Ms. Foster, you have 1 minute to respond.
So in addition to the explosions, which in lawsuits, actually, Anadarko executives have come out and said that a lack of oversight on behalf of their company is what caused those men to die in their homes. We've seen 15 other explosions in the state that have resulted in death and injury. So we also see on average 2 spills a day in the state. So toxic spills are a routine thing for the industry. There was 17,000 reported emission leaks to the COGCC just last year. On the Front Range, the American Lung Association has ranked our air quality as an F, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as well as NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, has said that up to 55% of that pollution comes directly from oil and gas extraction, not from the burning of fossil fuels, from the emissions from the extraction process. And it's highest in places like Weld County and Erie, where we see the densest oil and gas.
Thank you. I'm going to direct this question at you, Ms. Foster. It says, how would mineral owners be compensated for the $56 million loss they will suffer from not being able to develop their resources, and where would the money to compensate them come from? You have 2 minutes to answer this.
So first of all, the analysis that I referenced earlier from the Colorado School of Mines addressed the fact that minerals will not be isolated by the proposition. The industry can, using technology that's already available to them, can drill up to 4 miles horizontally underground. and they regularly drill 2 miles underground, permit 2 miles underground in Colorado. This map analyzed what minerals would still be available to be extracted using horizontal drilling based off of the COGCC's surface area map, which is what the industry references for their band numbers. But what this information shows is that oil and gas will still continue to produce. They'll still be able to access those minerals well into the future. And in regards to the takings argument, takings is limited. Our property rights are limited, and they're limited in that you cannot, property rights do not trump our right to health and safety. So regulations that protect the public's health and safety are not subject to takings. That's why you've never seen a successful takings lawsuit in New York, which has banned oil and gas development, because they don't have a case for it.
Thank you. Ms. Oliver Cook, you have 2 minutes.
Well, there's $56 billion worth of mineral rights that people actually own, and it is real wealth in that mineral owners have a right to be compensated for. Make no mistake, this is a ban. Something like 85% of private lands will be off limits. This is a ban. These people will need to be compensated, and it will bankrupt the state of Colorado to have to compensate them. And then I got to tell you, when it comes to things like the health, just let me, if I can address that real quick. There's been a 117% increase in the number of oil and gas wells in Weld County in between 2002 and 2015. At that same time, a 1.9% decrease in rates of death from all types of cancer, 21.4% decrease in rates of death from all types of heart disease, and a 9.1% decrease in rates of death from all types of chronic lower respiratory diseases. That's in Weld County. So if it's having the devastating impact on health that Ms. Foster says it is, we aren't actually seeing it in the place that is actually developing most of the oil and gas here in the state of Colorado.
All right. And I'm actually going to continue this discussion, and Ms. Foster, I'll give you 1 minute to respond to her comments.
Sure. Since the oil and gas boom in 2008, 2009, the stillborn rate in Weld County has actually doubled, and it's higher than all surrounding counties. The CDPHE has looked at the cause for that. They have not been able to identify it, but they have not looked at oil and gas development. A study out of Pennsylvania that was done by Princeton University and the University of Chicago looked at 1.1 million babies over 10 years and showed that babies that women that are pregnant within a kilometer, so about 3,200 feet of oil and gas development, are 25% more likely to give birth to babies with low birth weight than mothers that are pregnant further away, so about 3 kilometers away. So that's an incredibly robust study that showed definitive data pointing to negative health impacts, and we are seeing the results of that in Weld County.
You have 1 minute.
That isn't a definitive study because they didn't look at things like cigarette smoking. Also, you have to look at the increase in population in Weld County at the exact same time. So I would challenge those numbers. And by the way, the decrease in rates of death from cancer, heart disease, and chronic lower respiratory diseases decreased while the production has increased. Population has also increased. So the health scares over oil and gas production, I mean, it is just an argument that doesn't hold water. And as for emissions, overall emissions in Colorado have decreased 30% while production has increased.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to begin with you, Ms. Cook, on this one. Can you explain more, elaborate more on the economic impact? And you talk about this big loss of jobs. Can you explain a little more about where those numbers are coming from and how the overall impact would affect Colorado? You have 1 minute.
So the Colorado Business Roundtable did a study that found that it was roughly 150,000 jobs would be lost between now and 2030. 77% of those would come from industries outside of oil and gas, retail, public health, restaurants, any type of ancillary support service. This was just out, this literally was announced today. The loss to, this is from Petro Values. They estimate that the long-term economic loss across Colorado from the passage of 112 would be $470 billion. That's billion. Now, I just sat, I was sitting in the audience and I listened to people talking about we don't have enough money for transportation or schools. And now you're going to take this money out of our economy.
Thank you. Ms. Foster, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, so as I said before, this is absolutely not a ban. The Colorado School of Mines map shows that with the available surface area after 112 passes, there is still significant minerals reserves that will be available for extraction. So this will not end the industry whatsoever. There's still 55,000 active wells in Colorado that this doesn't apply to, that will still need workers to maintain them. In terms of the amount of jobs that they claim, these numbers are wildly exaggerated. There's less than 30,000 direct oil and gas jobs in the state of Colorado. According to a U.S. Department of Labor analysis that was done in June of this year, there was 29,000 jobs in oil and gas, mining, and logging combined. For comparison, there's over 320,000 jobs in outdoor recreation, of which oil and gas is a direct threat.
And I want to follow up on that with you, and you'll have 1 minute to answer this question. You mentioned how it's not a ban on fracking, but one of the comments we've received from people is, what are these vulnerable areas actually defined as, and what's to stop, a county, say like Boulder County, from, making so many vulnerable areas and essentially putting a ban on fracking? You have 1 minute.
Yeah, so the vulnerable areas that are identified are places like parks, amphitheaters, open spaces that have been designated by taxpayers for preservation and conservation. These are all areas where our families gather and expect to feel safe. The definition of waterways that is used is the EPA definition of waterways, so a federally recognized definition. And we feel that local control should be available to communities in regards to oil and gas, just like it is in regards to any other industry. The town of Erie has banned marijuana dispensaries within its borders, and communities should have the right to make those decisions for themselves. We feel that local control is important, and the oil and gas should be subjected to the same zoning that any other industry is subjected to in Colorado.
You have 1 minute.
So vulnerable areas could mean a dry creek bed that at some point just has water in it. So this puts, I'm going to say it again, 85 to 90% of private development off limits. This is not about local control. This is about banning an entire industry. Because if it were about local control, Weld County would be allowed to continue, as it has been, developing oil and gas, coming up with new technologies to make it cleaner and safer. But under 112, it would be off limits.
Thank you. And I'm going to direct this question at you, Amy Oliver Cook. This comes from the audience. This person says, I'm from the Western Slope where we could light our tap water on fire after fracking. What will the oil and gas industry do when there's no clean water to support life? You have 1 minute.
So the lighting of fire, lighting your water on fire, for instance, there is the Carbon Valley, where there's actually naturally occurring methane in water that you can light it on fire before there was oil and gas. So I would have to actually see that. Oil and gas uses a minuscule amount of water, a tiny amount of the water that is actually available in Colorado. The majority of our water is used for agriculture, and oil and gas recycles much of the water that it uses. And the EPA has even said there is no study that shows that hydraulic fracturing has actually polluted groundwater.
Ms. Foster, you have 1 minute.
So that EPA study is outdated, and they actually came out and said that there were instances of polluted groundwater. In terms of the amount of water that the industry uses, that water is permanently taken out of the hydrological cycle. So when it's used for agriculture, it can continue to be reused. It can continue to be drank by humans. When oil and gas uses water, they use it to extinction. It becomes radioactive. 2 Duke University studies that were just published about a month ago showed how fracking fluid interacting with the shale layer creates radioactive water. Once the industry has used that water into extinction, they then inject it into injection wells where under high pressure, it's injected into the ground and expected to stay there. And those injection wells are what cause earthquakes. We see in Oklahoma extensive earthquakes, and in Colorado, we are starting to have man-made seismic activity from injection wells.
Thank you, Ms. Foster. And can you explain how you got to the 2,500 feet number? Because current it's 500. So talk about going from that 2,000 setback and 2,000 more setback, and you have 1 minute to respond to this.
Yeah, great question. So the 2,500 feet is based off of a Colorado School of Public Health study that showed negative health impacts from living near oil and gas within a half mile, so a little further than 2,500 feet actually. And 2,500 feet is a standard evacuation radius used by first responders when there's an issue like a leak or an explosion at a well. So a few examples of that are last September in Greeley, Colorado. There was a toxic emissions leak that evacuated a high school football game on a Friday night to 2,500 feet. In just the past few weeks, we've seen 2 gas line explosions, one in Canada and one in Pennsylvania. Both of those used a 2,500 foot evacuation radius. And in the case of a catastrophic event, the 2,500 foot radius is actually an isolation zone that first responders won't even approach within.
Ms. Cook, I'm going to give you 1 minute to respond to that.
So the 2,500 foot is not based on an actual credible study. It is, and you have to think about it, 2,500 feet is actually almost a mile radius. If you talk to any first responders, I know I was married, I still am married to a man who's a former sheriff of Weld County. Evacuation perimeters are designed based on incident. If we're going to do 2,500 foot setbacks, we may as well start doing them now for railroad crossings. Or, I was driving down here today and I saw a sign that said 480 deaths this year on the road. We should have 25 foot setbacks for every single car. The point being is that there's no credible evidence, that there's no credible study that says that you will somehow magically be safer at 2,500 feet. It is an arbitrary number.
And Ms. Cook, I'm going to direct this question at you because there have been many bills that have gone through the legislature addressing this issue, and now it's going to the people. So is there a compromise on this issue? You have 1 minute to respond.
So you have to look at, it isn't just the industry that pushes back on this. We're talking about mineral owners. We're talking about businesses. We are talking about people whose livelihood depends upon this industry, and they cannot afford a ban. So the setback is 500 feet from homes, 1,000 feet from an occupied structure. These are a highly occupied structure like a school. These common sense regulations that are in place right now are the result of bipartisan work. These are groups, stakeholders from all over the state coming together and deciding on common sense regulations, not a ban on the industry.
Ms. Foster, you have 1 minute.
So once again, this is not a ban. All you have to do is look at the COGCC website and look at the complaints that are filed, thousands of complaints a year. People living with oil and gas complaining about the lights, lighting up their bedroom all night, noises like a jetliner in their children's bedrooms, so to the point where they don't sleep for weeks on end. They can't open up their windows because of nauseating smells. Their children are getting incessant nosebleeds and soak their pillows every night with blood. Mothers in the impacted areas call their children gushers because this is such an issue. So the current regulation, the current setback is not sufficient. You can see that based on the complaints filed at the COGCC. Dan Haley of Colorado Oil and Gas Association said that 500 feet was not based on health studies. It was an arbitrary number picked for political reasons. It needs to be updated, and science needs to be included in the process.
Thank you. Thank you both, and that's going to conclude the question and answer portion of this forum, and now we're going to move into your closing statements. Once again, I'll remind you that you have 1 minute to do so, and then that will wrap up our live forum. I'm going to begin with Ms. Foster for your 1 minute closing statement.
Thank you so much for having me, and I just want to remind everyone, how many times have we heard corporations try to disregard health impact studies? How many times have we heard corporations try to skimp on basic health and safety measures? This is no different. We've seen the same rhetoric in regards to the school setback bill, which was to increase the setback just to the property lines of schools. It had an absolutely zero impact on the economics of the economy. This is about protecting the health and safety of Coloradans and our long-term quality of life with a common sense setback based on science and based on the expertise of our first responders. And this is really about balancing the scales and creating a common sense setback for the people of Colorado in the face of politicians who have done nothing.
All right. Ms. Cook, you have 1 minute for your closing statement.
I'll conclude with what others have said about 112. Denver Post House editorial says that it hasn't seen evidence that oil and gas activity is the kind of unmitigated threat to health and safety that would merit a ban. Former Denver Mayor Wellington Webb said, "I don't like the United States being dependent on other people for oil. I believe it's very important for our energy independence that we're not beholden to Saudi Arabia and a lot of other countries around the world when we can have our own oil that's developed and done right here in the United States." Then he goes on with this. "I can also tell you that we in Colorado, the Colorado way, is not to set aside specific industries to go after them because we don't like them. We need to be supportive of the oil and gas because of what they provide in terms of energy independence and in terms of providing tax money we use in our local communities." Vote no on 112.
Thank you both for coming out here tonight. I think a lot of people gained a lot from hearing from both of your perspectives. I'm sure we could be here all night to continue to talk about this ballot question, but that's going to conclude the portion of all of our live forums tonight. We've got a few more things we've got to talk about, but let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
All right, and a reminder, as we talked about at the beginning of all of this forum, there are 9 other statewide ballot questions on your ballot. So you have a lot of things to get informed on and make sure that you're making the decision that is best for you. And we have information on all of those ballot questions on our website, KOAA.com. We have a full breakdown on the ones that we also talked about tonight that also go in depth on what these people were talking about. But few things as we're wrapping up this evening. If you have more questions on any of these ballot initiatives that you're going to see on your ballot, League of Women Voters will be here to answer questions on all 13 of those issues. They are prepared to talk about even more. So if there was something that we missed up here, you can certainly talk to them. But I'm going to hand over the floor because we want to thank Harrison School District for allowing us to use this space. And I'm going to give Jeannie Orozco, yes, give a round of applause to that. Jeannie Orozco, I'm going to hand the floor over to you so you can say a few words.
Thank you. You're much taller than me. First of all, I just want to say thank you. This is one of our high schools here in Harrison. My name is Jeannie Orozco. I sit on the Board of Education. I want to thank you for coming out and being diligent voters and community members and educating yourself. We had a lot of important things said tonight, and we want to make sure that everyone knows that we also here at Harrison have a bond on the ballot for E. We're asking our voters to just vote for our students and education. We haven't had any funding come in or ask our voters for funds in HSD2 in 17 years. That's a whole cycle of students coming in and out the door without any additional funding. We'd greatly appreciate your investment in our education, our students, and our buildings and facilities. If you have any questions for me in regards to 4E, I will stay after, but we really appreciate you just being educated in voting and diligent citizens. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much. And again, another reminder, you can stick around, ask some questions of our League of Women Voters, and to all of you tuning in on 5.2 and online at KOAA.com, thank you so much for joining us.